Underhill, Part 4. An original short story by Charlie C.C. Thomas. Wednesday, January 11th. Sarah walked through the open bedroom door, the warmth of the house breathing through her wool pajama bottoms and tank top. Her long, dark hair tumbled loosely around her as she reached for the banister and descended the stairs, eyes forward and unblinking, hand sliding over the railing with each slow step. She glided down, the world blurring at the edges through the tears falling over her cheeks for want to blink. She rounded the landing and padded on the warm floor, pulling without rock or sway as if the floor moved under her instead of her feet. She stared ahead, face slack as she stopped at the front door, lit by street lights through the tall windows either side. She lifted an arm and knocked on the wood, slow, hard knocks, like she should bang for someone's attention, but couldn't bring herself to do it. Her arm fell to her side after the seventh knock, and she swiveled on her heels to face the darkness, hair arching around her in a spray of black. She padded back through the foyer, down the hall beside the landing and into the kitchen archway, pulled across the floor like a doll on strings. She stopped at the back door, her hair jostling forward and tears spilling over with the force of it. Her skin bristled in goosebumps as warmth scaled up her legs, her back, and spread across her skin. Cinnamon, ginger, and clove wafted into her nose and stung her eyes as she lifted her arm and knocked. She tilted her head near the last knock, staring at the polished wood grain sheening in the faint light coming through the sink window. Its darkest rings shone like the weeping wood of the cathedral. Her arm fell after the seventh knock, and she stepped back, mouth watering as sweet, hot spices fluttered around her. Her heart leapt in her chest, thrumming like a bird as the tendrils of warmth soaked into her skin, washing up her legs, then down her spine like an echo. It fell on her, her nape and shoulders, in steady waves like breath, warm and sweet and hot. It made her hairs stand on end as fresh tears trekked her cheeks.
"The front door,"
something whispered far away and quiet like a secret.
"Remember the front door, Sarah. You're not done."
She swiveled on her heels and glided over the floor, hair spinning around her as she cut through the darkness. The kitchen blurred away like a memory as she passed the stairs into the foyer. She stared at the same naked wood as the back, left hand finding the bronze locks, then the knob, and pulled the door open on silent hinges. She looked into the dim night, stars just visible against the lamp-posts and town's light further out. The waxing moon shone pale and gentle on the sleeping world, turning everything gray and black, beaming off the snow like a blanket of silver. The wind rustled in the leaves and swam into the house, gliding against her pocket of warmth and spice and sweetness, never touching her. Tears fell as she looked down and tilted her head at the small dead bird on the doormat. She knelt and sat on her heels, eyes unwavering as large black wings beat against the dark, fixed on the dead thing. It was laid on its back, wings bent and folded wrong, little black legs stiff as twigs, its head bent to the side. She picked it up in one hand and held it in front of her face, weeping numbly as her other hand found its head, twisting it with a snap, and tore it free. She held it in her open palm, eyes falling over it and the trickle of blood against her pale hand. She stared, lifting the crumpled body to her face and opening her mouth, wide, wider and wider still, until her jaw should have popped, unhinged, snapped, until her lips should have torn. But they didn't. So she set the feathered corpse on her tongue and pushed it past her lips, the bloody stump of its neck trickling dead blood down her throat. Her fingers moved away. Her jaw snapped shut, bones crunching and blood and guts gushing between her teeth like a popped balloon. Warm blood and spittle traced the corners of her mouth and fell down her chin. She gnawed until blood and flesh slid down her throat, until the feathers were wet and crunched with the rest, until the bones were ground and shattered. The flight feathers broke and folded from between her lips, pulverized with everything else. The legs crunched like stale bread. Then she swallowed, licking her fingers clean, expressionless face forward, eyes unblinking, staring into the night and the sharp, unseen eyes of the shadow in the dark. She fixed her eyes with the pale figure, the pale shadow, and set the little head on the doormat, standing as the wind blew in her face and filled the foyer with spices and earth. She backed into the house and shut the door with clean fingers, licking her lips and wiping her chin as the locks were slid back in place. She turned on her heels and glided to the landing, slowly climbing the stairs with her arms hanging either side like dead flesh. She rounded the banister and stalked back into her bedroom, crawling under the blankets on her back beside Joseph, limbs stiff and hot, and shut her eyes. She opened them on her side, facing the bathroom and Joseph's side of the bed. Sighing, she sat up and rubbed her eyes, sliding up the bed to sit against the headboard with a long yawn. Her jaw cracked, drawing a cry from her as she grabbed the side of her face and held it. She rolled her jaw, stretching it open and shut a few times before she looked through the dark window and grabbed her phone for the time. She sighed and thought,
Joe's probably opening the shop by now.
She looked at the shut bedroom door and leaned like the dead against the headboard, with an internal groan, eyes fixed on the ceiling.
I'm not getting any more sleep tonight, am I?
She rolled onto her side and stretched to grab her laptop from the nightstand, setting it on her lap and blinking against the light. She signed in and scrolled through the dozens of documents, dozens of dreams that she could remember and ideas of what they were. She set her knuckles against her mouth, biting her lips as the files rolled in front of her, finally stopping at Dream 203. She swallowed and opened a new document, dating it and letting the dream flow out of her fingers while it was still fresh, eyes flicking to Riley in his crib by the window. Her eyes hung there, grinning at the blissful silence before another yawn possessed her. She fell back into her laptop and finished the dream, leaving the speculation for later as she shut it and returned it to the nightstand. Then she snuck into the bathroom and got ready for another day of figuring out how to be a mother. She stood over Riley and sniffed, nose wrinkling before she pulled his onesie open and cleaned him up. His huge eyes opened with the start of a cry, twisting his face until he found her leaning over him. He stopped and stared, shining blue eyes almost like stained glass in the moonlight. She smiled at him and gave him her fingers to play with as she finished wiping him clean, stretching her face into a cartoonish smile as she grabbed his feet and pulled him up for a new diaper. He laughed, mouth not quite lifting into a smile, but the high, shrill joy on the air made her warm and grin all the wider. She wrapped him in the fresh diaper and changed his onesie, picking him up and holding him above her head. Her noises and silly faces pulled more and more laughs from Riley as he squirmed and kicked in a dance. She chuckled and brought him to her hip, pulling her locks over the opposite shoulder as she opened the bedroom door and made her way to the kitchen, letting him suck her hair into his mouth and pulling it away when he got too enthusiastic. She padded into the kitchen and stopped in the doorway, a chill dancing up her back under the tank top as the dream flared behind her eyes in the dark. She sighed, jaw tense as she flicked on the light and padded across the room to the coffee maker, finding it stocked and full of water with a note from Joseph in front. She smiled, pressing the button to perk the coffee and setting Riley down in his playpen between the island and the dining table. She picked it up and smiled wide as she breathed the words to herself. Babe, I know things aren't perfect or easy, especially now that we're figuring out how to be parents, but it's beautifully messy, and I wouldn't trade it for the world. You're the light in my right eye, and Riley's the light in the other. I love you, Sarah. I'll call you when I'm on lunch. Hope your day with Riley's awesome. She grinned.
My big dumb dork.
She kissed the note and set it aside, stopping to make Riley laugh on her way to the fridge. She patted her stomach and sighed, looking down at the bloat and extra flesh.
I can't wait to get rid of this.
She flicked back to the fridge and grazed over the contents, pulling out 2 eggs and jumping as one slipped through her fingers. It fell and splattered to the floor. She sighed and grabbed another egg, setting them both in a bowl only for them to crack open and spill on her fingers. She glowered at the bowl, then sighed and left them for the paper towels to clean up the egg on the floor and throw it away with the shells floating in the bowl. She reached for a fork from the dishwasher and gasped at the sting across her knuckle. She sucked her finger into her mouth, looking down for the knife and furrowing her brow when she didn't find it. She pulled her finger free and turned it over. No blood, no cut, no pain. She chuckled breathily to herself and tilted her head in a scoff.
You're losing it, Sarah. Let's see if you can make it through breakfast.
She popped a slice of bread into the toaster without incident and cooked the eggs without breaking anything, though she cursed herself for missing the handle of the pan more than once. She stepped back and looked at everything, smiling when nothing exploded, and pouring a cup of black coffee before leaning over Riley. She smiled wide, and his eyes beamed, dancing on his back and reaching for her. She tickled his stomach, drawing more giggles, and bopped his nose before giving him a toy and returning to her eggs.
You know, little man, I never liked black coffee until I had you.
She looked over her shoulder with a grin, stirring.
Thanks for that. I've been trying to cut the sugar in the morning for years.
She turned back to the stove and chuckled.
Just took having a kid. No biggie.
She buttered her toast as the eggs finished, cursing when she dropped the knife on the floor. She plated the eggs on the toast and sat beside Riley's pen, plate and cup aside, as she watched him play. She grinned as he tossed a toy against the netted walls, wide, curious eyes following it as his lips pursed, waiting for it to come back. She tilted her head, eyes on him as she reached for her cup, groping the floor when she didn't find it until she furrowed her brows and turned away. She froze, staring at her hand as it sat over the steaming rim of her mug. She chuckled to herself and picked it up, sipping it once and again before she looked at her plate and scooped up her toast with egg, munching beside Riley and scooting until her back was against the island. She swallowed and sighed, moving to set her breakfast on the plate where she'd left it and cursing when it landed on the rim and fell to the floor. She rolled her eyes and shoved it to safe territory, scooping up her coffee and frowning to herself before she turned and found Riley staring up at her. She smiled down at him and kissed her hand, pressing her fingers to his forehead.
Mommy's being silly, huh?
She chuckled, annoyed.
Can't seem to do anything right this morning.
She found his big blue eyes, and the bitter knots loosened in her stomach.
Except with you. You always love what Mommy does, don't you?
Thursday, January 12th. Sarah stood before their bedroom window and lifted her right arm, knocking the glass 7 times with her fingertip, and staring blankly at the night world beyond. The waxing moon and stars came dim. The wind stirred, circling their house as she spun on her heels and padded into the bathroom, knocking on the window 7 times before gliding out, eyes forward, unblinking and aching. She stopped at Riley's crib and picked him up, staring at the wall and cradling his head as she moved him to one hip and glided through the bedroom door, leaving it to swivel shut on its own. She floated to the stairs, taking the steps one at a time, staring blindly as her free hand dragged over the railing. Her head jerked sideways as Riley tugged on her loose, tangled locks with a giggle. She stopped, back straight, body stiff, and creaked her head down at him, tears falling down her cheeks. Riley looked up and giggled, big blue eyes delving into hers, and dimming as the joy trickled out of his face. He rolled forward until his forehead was buried in her bare chest. Her unseeing eyes stared at the wall before turning forward and restarting her slow descent, Riley bouncing with the weight of each step until they reached the landing. She glided across the floor, silent tears trekking down her cheeks as she navigated the darkness into the kitchen. She opened a drawer and pulled out a paring knife, pricking her nipple nearest Riley and setting it back into the dishwasher, face forward all the time. She repositioned him in her arms so his head was at her breast and guided the nipple into his mouth, holding him there until he took it and nursed her milk and blood alike. She walked naked through the blackness to the front door, rapping 7 times on both slender windows either side the posts. She turned on her heels, arm like steel around Riley so that he didn't move and never stopped feeding, and gliding into the living room, the kitchen, dining room, washroom, and storeroom. She found every window and knocked 7 times on each, until she landed on the final rap, in the storeroom. She backed into the middle of the room amid the canned fruits of her labor, filed neatly on shelves, ceiling to floor, and breathed. Warmth settled up her skin, rising from the floor and traveling out from her spine. Goosebumps bristled every hair on her body as silent tears fell onto Riley. Cinnamon and clove tickled her nose before something hotter swam inside, making her mouth water as sweat beaded and cooked on her skin. Cold. Winter's breath wafted over her nape, bringing dry earth and dust into her nose, pulling up dreams of harvested wheat fields, sleeping gardens, and abandoned ruins reclaimed by green things. It washed down her back in slow, careful waves, steady as breath, bristling her skin with each pass. But she didn't shiver. She stood like a breathing statue as silent tears peppered her breasted sun.
"The door,"
a cool voice whispered in the back of her mind.
"Remember the door, Sarah. Come and see."
She swiveled on her heels and glided through the dark house, past the dining room and kitchen, past the stairs and into the foyer. Riley pulled away from her breast as she reached for the locks and knob. She paused, hair swaying in the abrupt stop, and glided into the living room, setting him into his playpen with unblinking eyes and swimming back to the front door. The oiled grain shimmered black with unseen light as she opened it on the dim night and street lights. The wind swam through the skeletal trees, tossing up the loose snow as cold smacked her and barged past to freeze and still the house. She breathed the warm spices and swallowed, looking down to the doormat and the dead cat laid there. She tilted her head, eyes unblinking and body still as a photograph. Its dappled fur was smooth and kept, sprawling over heavy limbs and spilling gut, its tail straight out, head half turned away and mouth under yellow eyes. Sarah took it in both hands, fingers squeezing its neck until the bones shifted beneath, cracking and snapping. Her face was stone as the flesh sank under her fingernails, fur and skin giving way to spurts of old blood as her fingers slid deeper. She twisted its neck twice around, picking and tearing its flesh until only a few strands tied the skull to the rest of the body. She leaned over the threshold and took the strands between her teeth, grinding them down until they snapped, and the head was free. She set the skull above the cat's back, corpse blood seeping onto the mat and her fingers as she peeled the skin away at the hem of the throat. Her fingers slid between the flesh and hide, gripped it, and tore it in two down the belly until she could peel it free like a rabbit. She folded the little pelt and set it to her right on the porch before laying the carcass on its back and spreading the front limbs out until they cracked and popped. She twisted the shoulders around and around, forward and back until they snapped free, then again to the rear legs, and held one in her hands. Leaning over it, Sarah stretched open her mouth and sank her teeth into the bloody raw flesh, tearing, gnawing, and grinding the stringy, tough strands. She gulped, the flesh half chewed, and again, and again, and again. She picked each limb clean, front to rear, and set the bones beside the pelt before rolling the torso onto its spine and plunging her thumbs into its gut. Dark blood welled and spilled over the abdomen, soiling the mat as she slid 8 fingers into the wound and pried it open like a candy bag. Her unblinking eyes were fixed forward into the darkness as she reached inside and pulled out the cat's liver, slurping it down, then its kidneys and the pancreas. Her stomach bulged as she gnawed the last and gulped it down, staring at the pale shadow in the street, invisible eyes sharp, unseen hands motioning her as it smiled wide and wider. She pierced the diaphragm, dark hair sticking to her bloody lips and chin as the wind tossed it around her, copper and filth staining her tongue and churning in her gut as she reached into its chest and tore its lungs and heart free. She tilted her head back and opened her mouth, stretching until her jaw should have locked, spreading her lips until they should have torn over bloody teeth and crammed the lungs inside. She bit down, squeezing the air out between her teeth as bits of the pale flesh dangled over her lips and chin. She chewed, weeping eyes drinking the unseen figure as she swallowed pieces and chunks, shoving the dangling remnants into her mouth with each gesture of the shadow's hands. She gulped them down, half-eaten, and lifted the tiny dark heart in front of her face, tilting her head as the pale shadow swelled around it.
"Eat your fill,"
the cold voice whispered again, springing up new goosebumps down her back. She opened her mouth and shoved the heart to the back, feverishly chewing like her gut had been empty for days. The old blood was bitter, her breath stinging her eyes and nose and fouling the sweet hot spices that danced at her face despite the churning wind. She swallowed, heart pounding in her ears as her stomach groaned, pressing beneath her ribs like it might burst. She stood, licking her fingers clean, and shut the door on the night and the shadow. She blinked, and was swallowed by darkness. She blinked, and strained her eyes against the moonlight in her bedroom window, groaning as sleep left her. The bed shifted, and she smiled as a warm body pressed against her back, strong arm lacing her waist. She reached for Joseph's hand and looked back, stopping when his lips touched her cheek. She hummed as he pressed their bodies together, fitted like puzzle pieces, and moved back until she could shimmy between his hips.
"I love you,"
he whispered in her ear and smiled, chuckle becoming a groan at her touch. He grabbed her hips. "I wish we had time."
"Don't we?"
She spun around and kissed his mouth, twining their legs and smiling at his groan. His hands were firm on her shoulders as he held her at bay. "I woke up late. But, God, how I want to." She kissed his lips.
"Then either make it quick, and I'll help you get ready, or be prepared to get jumped when you get home."
He looked at her mouth and bit his lip, dark eyes getting darker before he grinned and pulled her against him, fingers making quick work.
"Good choice,"
she chuckled. They busied about the kitchen, Sarah flicking between the baby monitor and Joseph's second meal, Joseph slinging his feet into his boots over his uniform and throwing his arms through the sleeves. "Don't worry about all of it," he said, kissing her cheek and zipping up the front of his uniform. "I can order something later." She flicked up to the clock and cursed, setting the food in his cooler bag.
"Oh, you'll have to. I'm sorry."
She kissed him, her hand on his arm as he took her face and deepened it, just for a moment, before pulling away with a smirk. "Never be sorry for that." She smiled and pushed him toward the front door.
"I'll jump your bones every morning then. Just get out before you're chewed out."
"Yes, ma'am." He sprinted through the yard, jacket pulled close as his boots crunched in the snow on the path to their front gate. He spun and waved to her. "See you later, babe." She waved from the doorway, pulling her robe closed. He saluted to her before hopping into his truck and driving off into the dark and cold. She leaned against the doorpost, still aching from him, as she stared across the street to the dark between the streetlights. There was nothing there, but the shadow of a memory made her swallow, made her hand fall to her stomach, made her mouth water with the taste of blood. A dead cat flashed behind her eyes as she stepped back into the house, eyes falling to the clean doormat. She swallowed again, flicking her gaze away as the headless corpse flickered in and out of view. She spun and shut the door, closing her eyes and shaking her head.
"No,"
she thought.
"You will not ruin my morning. You're just a dream."
"You're just a dream." Her lips were tender, bleeding in one corner from his teeth. Her fingers brushed over her mouth as she let the morning wash over the dream. She breathed deeply and grinned, chuckling as she pushed off the front door to the kitchen.
"We haven't moved that fast since we were kids."
She sighed, the bliss still riding through her blood as she found the still hot coffee maker and made herself a cup. She leaned on the counter and tilted her head as the little yellow notes rose and fell in her mind.
I should do a little something special,
she mused to herself, turning to the baby monitor.
It's your 1 month, after all.
She sipped her coffee, thinking,
He's been so patient after the delivery. And then this morning...
She laughed to herself.
This isn't your honeymoon, kid.
But the ham they'd had on their honeymoon flared in the back of her head, glistening beside the wine and starlight and ocean.
I could do that,
she said on her way to the stairs.
It's been a while, and they'll be cheaper since it's after Christmas. Besides, we've got a little extra money from that collector in the city.
She smiled wide and rounded the banister upstairs, cup of coffee sweeping wide as she continued.
That settles it. Ham it is.
She sauntered into the bedroom and stood over Riley, smiling down at his sleeping face as he twitched in his own dreams.
I hope yours are sweeter, little man.
She sat on the bed, covers still crumpled and stinking of sex. She set her cup down and checked the time.
Still a few hours before the store opens.
She stripped and remade the bed, tossing the old sheets into the wash and climbing back upstairs, wincing at her chest. She turned the upstairs light on and sighed. Milk leaked from her right breast, but the left was dry. She returned to the bedroom, stripping her tank top and walking to Riley's crib with a grin. She set her hand on his front, feeling his heartbeat, the rise and fall of his chest, the tiny twitches. She leaned down and sniffed, hanging her head with a sigh. She changed him, smiling as he opened his bright blue-green eyes. He blinked at her, giggling at her funny faces as she cleaned him and pulled him out of the onesie. She hefted him up in naught but his diaper and brought him to her right breast. He latched on and drank deeply, pulling her lips into a smile as she sat on the edge of the bed and pulled her laptop beside her, sipping her coffee and opening the most recent dream. Yesterday's. She opened it and read, clearing her throat and stroking Riley's skin.
It's so similar,
she thought.
Why the change to a cat, though?
She popped her fingers and made sure Riley was secure before she opened a new file, and let the dream bloom behind her eyes before the waking banished it, left hand dancing like a spider to bring it to life on screen. Dream written and notes made, Sarah stepped into their closet beside the bathroom and rifled through the clothes, shivering against the draft. She sighed, outfit draped over her arm as she stepped back and shut the door. A shadow stood at the edge of her vision, an invisible outline against the darkness outside the window. Her head whirled around. Nothing stared back at her. She couldn't move, breath short and hard as wide eyes bored into the air before the window. Her nape bristled, chills traveling down her back and arms as the memory of a silhouette stood invisible, yet plain as day, staring at her with unseen eyes. She swallowed as the silence of the room swam into her ears, loud and strange, like they were plugged. Her eyes broke from the nothing to scan the room, landing on Riley's crib as he sneezed and falling back on the solid nothing. She smirked, not believing it, and scoffed as she tossed the clothes onto the bed. She breathed a laugh, peeking into Riley's crib and ignoring the chills running down her right arm, the watchful nothing by the window, and slipped into the bathroom. Teeth brushed, hair combed, and face clean, she threw her locks into a braid over one shoulder and went to Riley. He woke as she changed him, big blue-green eyes smiling up at her before flicking to the ceiling. He stuck his fingers in his mouth and giggled, flailing his arms like someone was playing with him and shaking his head back and forth at the empty air. She swallowed and set her hand on his chest, forcing a smile as she told him he was silly. Nervous eyes flicked up to the air by the window and back down to finish the job before rushing into her jeans, boots, and sweater. A chill ran up her spine as she picked up Riley and put him in his warm clothes, hugging him tight to her body as the shadow appeared across the room. She spun, eyes going to the door, open on the dark bathroom, as she sprinted out the room and down the stairs. Nate, bristling like a lion, watched her in the trees. She laughed at herself and set through the house for the front door, locking it behind her as she shivered. The air was still in the dark of the morning as she walked the path through the yard, dirty snow crunching underfoot and slushing aside as she swept the gate open. She turned and jumped at the crooked shape in front of the white fence. mocking herself as she passed the mailbox and unlocked her car. She started the engine and set Riley in the back, buckling him into his car seat before taking the wheel and pulling onto the empty road. Mix-matched orange and white lights shone down from above as she went, passing from the wooded housing to the beginning of town. Red tail lights passed like dying stars, and headlights glared like the pale shadow's sharp eyes. Her skin crawled in waves, eyes flitting around when she slowed the car to a stop, turning back to Riley whenever she could. Her guts knotted up like fighting snakes, chest tight and pounding in her temples. Something breathed down her neck, something dark and cold and watchful. Some part of her, the animal buried under layers of humanity, screamed to run and save Riley. Something itched under her skin, like there were glowing eyes at the edge of firelight, like fangs and claws clicked patiently from the dark, like something hungry loomed in the branches and licked its lips. She pulled into the grocery store parking lot and swam through the empty spots to the one closest the doors, killing the engine and sitting back. She breathed deeply and smiled, if only to make herself feel better.
"You're not a kid," she thought. "There's nothing here, just get a grip."
She added aloud,
"You're not even scared of the dark."
She looked in the rearview mirror and jumped, frozen and choking on her breath as silver eyes met hers and slid down to Riley, marble face breaking in a too-wide smile. The ice shattered in her veins and she whirled around, red and gold streaking, and faced the empty back seat. She flicked from one end to the other, but there was only Riley, looking up at her with heavy eyes, nearly honey in the orange lights outside. Sarah swallowed and settled back into her seat, fingers knitted together in her lap as she shut her eyes and shook her head. She flew out of the car, grabbing Riley with a mask of a smile, and walked into the store, long strides pulling her as the hairs on her nape, the back of her head, stood on end. She breathed hard from her nose, squinting, forcing herself to not turn around as the automatic doors parted for her. She sat Riley in the shopping carriage and dashed into the bright, sterile light, swallowing up the darkness from outside and leaving every shadow small and crushed beneath its caster. She passed the employees, some with eyes too bright for the hour, others dark and dead, smiling and nodding to them as she went and flicking away before they could smile. She ignored the twists to their blurry faces that promised grins, swallowing as she kept her eyes on the aisle signs, letting the widening grins slip behind her with their pale skin and bright eyes and yellow uniform. She turned into the blissfully empty frozen food section and sprinted down the aisle, eyes flitting over the freezer bins and stopping when she spotted the hams, half off. She parked and hooked the plastic netting with her fingers, setting it into the carriage. She gasped at the cold thud on her foot and crash, jumping back with a hiss as her toes screamed at her. She bit her cheek, furrowing her brows at the ham laying on the floor, and flicked between it and the empty carriage. She limped to the side and tested the metal walls for a hole in the seam, but there was nothing. She stood up and sighed, rubbing across her eyes and pinching the bridge of her nose. "Do you need some help?" She jumped and gripped her chest, laughing when she found a middle-aged man standing a few feet away, red employee shirt still vibrant in the overhead light. She shook her head as he apologized, his grin crooked but finding its way into his pale blue eyes. She bent over and grabbed the ham, careful to watch as she set it into the carriage before coming around the front to stroke Riley's stomach through the blanket. "I'm sorry," he said. "I just thought you might be having a rough start." She chuckled and faced him, smiling with a sigh when she still found him the way he was, and not the pale blur of everyone else.
"You'd be right. I just haven't slept well. New mom."
She motioned to Riley with a wide smile, wondering if her dark circles were as bad as she thought. He followed her with his eyes, his grin falling, somehow, dimming and glazed in a memory. "It's all right. It gets easier." She waited for him to continue, staring as his face suddenly looked so much older, eyes deep and full, yet so hollow. She broke the silence.
"Does it really, or is that just to make me feel better?"
They chuckled before he pocketed his hands in black uniform pants, face and eyes young again, and fingers sparkling with 3 gemmed rings. Well, I should say you get used to it eventually. My wife and I had a rough start with our first one, but we were pros by our second.
That's actually kind of a relief. Thanks.
He smiled sadly, nodding like her father always did when he had something else to say that he probably shouldn't. It was tough after she passed, but we've had plenty more. One way or another. Sarah tilted her head, chest tight again as she lied with a sad smile.
I'm sorry.
Don't be. His pale eyes found hers and a chill fell down her back. That buried animal clawed at her skin to run from the unseen lion in the dark.
Would you like any help? It's okay.
She swallowed, face tight around her smile as her hand found the handle of the carriage between the man and Riley. All right then, I'll leave you to it, Miss Sarah. He backed away with a wide smile, blonde hair almost white in the light before he turned with a wave, fingernails long. She nodded and turned, gripping the cart and pushing it opposite him, stopping at the corner. She looked over her shoulder for him and found the empty aisle, brows furrowed as she faced the carriage. Her fingers kneaded the handle as she whispered,
Did I tell him my name?
She swallowed and looked back down the aisle as another employee passed by, yellow shirt almost white in the fluorescence. She flicked away and sprinted past the deli for the produce, thinking,
I must have. God, you're keeping me up too much, kid.
She hurried through the store, smiling politely at the employees busying themselves like drunken bees. She ignored the pale smiles and sharp eyes they had at the edge of sight, grabbing the produce and leaving the ones she'd dropped to rush to the register. She barely looked for the cashier, body thrumming like 100 mad birds were thrashing against her insides, trying to break their cage. She shivered, guts sliding around one another as she paid and pushed the cart out the doors into the howling morning. The gray skies were alight in pastels as the sun struck from behind, but the wind rushed at her, squirming its fingers up her shirt and biting, clawing for her to come with it. She threw the bags into the back seat and locked Riley in place, jumping behind the wheel and cranking the key. Her heart crept up into her throat and back down into her trunk, fighting and ready to bolt all at once. She pressed the gas pedal and drove, Grimshaw a blur, the houses a haze, until she stopped and pulled her eyes off the road. She was parked in front of her house. She gripped the wheel until the leather cover groaned. As quickly as breath, the feel of the hungry eyes over her back, the prick of animal flight that pushed her foot too hard on the gas, the chill down her spine, died and left her alone with her clammy hands and Riley. He whined and whimpered behind her.
It's okay, baby.
She furrowed her brows and let her hands fall into her lap.
We're home. It's all right.
She brought everything inside and set to work in the kitchen, cranking up the heater as she seasoned the ham in a deep pan, preheating the oven as she sliced the vegetables and sautéed them in order, fighting the fates as the kitchen revolted. The garlic and onions had rolled and hopped away to the floor 3 times, even after putting them in a bowl. The knives clanged out of her hands, slicing her fingers on the way out and leaving the island speckled with crimson. The measuring cup had shattered as she whisked the ham glaze, sending half of it in the sink and dripping down the cabinets along with shards of glass. Wherever she tidied or cleaned, her elbows knocked into something else for her hands to tend to. When she glazed the ham, the spreader tumbled to the floor, then the spatula, until she finally poured and smeared it into the crevices with her bare hands. She lifted the pan to move it from the island to the stovetop and crushed 2 fingers. And Riley, for the first time in a long time, cried like a banshee. Sarah leaned over the stove, closing her eyes and fighting a scream of curses. 1,000 small knots bunched up inside from 1,000 little things. Her jaw clenched as Riley's screams came louder, as something else clattered to the floor, as the antique clock ticked. She took a deep breath, shoulders tight, breath hot, as her lips bunched together and the darkness behind her lids swam. They came in color, then gray, and sculpted themselves in old, familiar shapes. Riley let out a cry that stabbed into Sarah's ears, and the nebulous shapes rushed into the catacombs. The helpless babe wailed for her, clawing the air for her, begging for her help. as something tore it apart. The darkness rushed, walls and bones past, jolting her to stop at the fork in the tunnels, bringing her eye to eye with the baby's skull, jaw clattering the mortar loose and whispering, "Mama." Riley screamed, and it smacked her skull like a fist, shooting down into her guts as the darkness became sterile white stone, the black stage, the watchful stained-glass window. Her own screams echoed in her ears. The old ache burned between her legs. She held her baby's head in her hands and pushed. The pale man smiled at her, with Riley in his claws. She flung open her eyes, heart racing and sweat cold as she forced a long, slow breath and swirled to wash her hands. She leaned over Riley, pouting at him as she picked him up and held him in one arm, tapping his nose to his annoyance. She kissed the tears away and pretended to gobble him up, mouthing over his cheeks and neck and hands until he stopped, and even the fat-lipped pout vanished. Her own voice echoed in her ears. "You will not become her." She sighed, returning to stir the onions and garlic in a buttered pan as she bobbed Riley in her arm. "I don't know what's going on, dude." She kissed Riley's temple as he watched her. "But nothing seems to be going right today." She laughed bitterly and turned her jaw to the side, raising her eyebrows as she stirred with a huff. "Smile," a small part of her said. "Make yourself feel better." "Oh, self," she said aloud. "If only it were so simple." The employee at the grocery store crept into the back of her mind as she stared at the pan, the red gleaming behind her eyes like a bloody rag. His persistent smile and pale eyes watched her from inside her own head. She sighed. "That guy probably just got me uneasy. Or made it worse." She continued navigating small disasters, sliding the pan off the heat once the green beans were soft but firm, and setting Riley down. Her heart twisted upside down and backwards when he nearly slipped from her fingers, catching his head to lay him on the blanket in his playpen. She shivered at the idea of the smack it would make, and stood in front of the oven, fingers toying with her lips as she waited for the beep. When it screamed at her, she opened the oven and covered the ham, warily lifting the pan and sliding it inside, keeping her fingers away from the hot metal as the roiling air slapped at the sweat on her arms and face. She shut it with a thud, rocking the oven and sending the salt shakers crashing to the hot stovetop and shattering. She clenched her jaw and shut her eyes, letting her head fall back as she breathed deeply and swept up the salt and glass with her towel. "At least it didn't get in the beans, huh, bud?" she asked Riley as she set the time on the stove and pulled out her grandmother's old kitchen timer. She twisted the dial and set it ticking, grinning as her fingers brushed the worn red plastic and the memory of the wrinkly hand that gave it to her when she and Joseph first moved in together. Her face was no better than a wrinkly vision of Sarah's mother, but there was something else in her eyes, and the spirit of her smiles, that made her look twice as young and lively. "A soul," Sarah thought. She sighed and chided herself, whispering, "Stop that. She's gonna be in your life now with Riley, so just make peace already." She wiped the glaze off the cabinets and rinsed the rag before returning to finish the job. She stopped and stared at the brown smear across the wood grain, pulling the rag away and unfurling it, the glaze still glistening. She rinsed the rag out again, squeezing and rinsing a third time until the water came out clear. She kneeled down and furrowed her brows at the clean cabinets. She stood and held the rag over the sink, squeezing brown water from the fibers. She chuckled nervously and rinsed the rag again, laying it over the edge of the sink. "You really are losing it." She grabbed the broken measuring cup, gasping and reeling away as fresh blood dripped down her forearm. She cursed, holding her hand over the sink as she flicked between the flower of broken glass and the shard sticking out of her palm. She slowly pulled it out and moved the flesh around. No shards broken inside, washing it under scalding water. She hissed, but kept it still, cursing herself and turning off the water to grab the cup by the base and gently set it into the trash can. She turned around and grabbed a paper towel, holding it tight to stop the bleeding as she let the water run into the mixing bowl, and everything else she dirtied and dropped.
By the end, blissfully without another injury, the dishwasher was full and the blood had stopped. She tossed the towel into the can, standing over it enough to see the bottom. She turned away for a moment before she realized what was there, flashing a confused smile as she turned back. The measuring cup was gone. She turned, scanning the counters, and found it sitting where she'd left it. She looked around, swallowing. "Joe?" She went to the archway next to the stairs, looking down the hall to the foyer. Empty. She turned back into the kitchen, grazing her hand on the wall corner and wincing in anticipation, but the pain never came. She looked down and waited for the blood to well, but there was nothing. No pain, no blood, and no wound. She felt the skin, holding her hand close to her face before returning to the measuring cup and staring at it. She sighed through her nose and scooped it up by the base, setting it in the can. Again. She looked at her hand in the light from the window, turning it over and pressing her thumb into the place the wound had been, but there was nothing. Just the indent of her thumbnail and the buzzing confusion beating inside her guts like a shaken hornet's nest. She set her hand down and scooped Riley up, taking him and the timer into the living room and leaving the trouble in the kitchen. "I really need more sleep," she thought as she set the timer on the coffee table and brought Riley to her chest to feed. He latched on, and she winced, pulling him away to look at the scab on her left nipple, small and slender. "God, am I cracking already?" She checked both twice as Riley fussed and squirmed in her arms, and she let him take her left breast, gritting her teeth as he suckled and reopened the wound. "Must have scratched myself on the night or something." She flicked on the television, ignoring last night's dream and shoving down the ball of anxiety in her chest, swallowing against the persistent memory of her labor, hazy and twisted with her dream as it was. The first pale arm slid out between her legs as the other came, pulling her apart until she should have been dead. The pale, veiny caricature of a child turned to face her. It smiled wide and wider still until its face was cut in half like a claymation horror. She swallowed and flicked to a random streaming service, finding the first thing she could and blasting the volume to shut up her echoing screams and the demon's whispers. "Mama! Mama, I hunger!" Sarah stared at the television, trying and failing to watch whatever she could click on. She swallowed and curled in on herself, pulling Riley away for the other breast without looking down, body running itself as her dreams swam through her, flashing at random until they glued together into a broken puzzle that somehow made a coherent picture. She shut her eyes and looked away from it, 2 large streams of tears falling from her cheeks. She flicked them back open to look down at Riley and wipe her tears out of his hair, staring and smiling as he nursed. She held him a little closer, teeth bright in a widening smile. Warmth settled down her chest and into her gut, easing away the churning snakes and cooling the hot lead. The chimeric dreams settled into the back of her mind, its choir of shouts and screams becoming voices, then whispers, then breath and silence. She watched him as he nursed, as he pulled away and yawned. She burped him and laughed at his little sounds, his dancing hands and feet as she rocked him side to side. She laid back and sighed as he fell asleep on her chest. The timer rang like an angry schoolbell. Sarah looked to the coffee table, as if the sound wasn't enough to say it was done counting, but the timer was gone. She sighed and slowly stood to keep Riley asleep, scanning the table, the area rug, the shadow beneath, but there was nothing. "I must have knocked the table when I went to sit," she thought, setting Riley and his pen beside the couch and going into the kitchen. She opened the oven, heat waves darting up into her face and cramming in the sweet, savory breath of the glaze. She double-checked the timer on the stove, blinking and beeping loud as the other, and turned it off. She picked up the pot with towels and set it on the stovetop, pulling off the lid and drinking in the sight and smell. Glistening, golden, and perfect, she thought as she shut the oven. She cried and jerked her hand away from the burning rim of the inside of the door. She knocked it shut with her knee and went to the sink, cold water pouring over the burnt crescent on her thumb. She hissed and winced, cursing herself as the pain spread into her hand and the water ran pink. She stared, pulling her hand away, but there was no blood from the burn. She opened her fingers and furrowed her brow as crimson wept from where she'd cut it with glass. She pulled her hand away, opening and closing it as trickles of blood seeped from the edges and dripped into the sink. The sting was gone from the cut, leaving a dull ache that throbbed with her thumb until her whole hand pulsed with its own heartbeat. The silence rang, coming in from a distance until the air snapped in her ears from behind. She faced the kitchen door and the ringing, sighing as she flicked from her hand to the door and sprinted, turning off the oven as she passed. She crossed the foyer to the living room and walked halfway to the table to start the search again before stopping. The old, worn, once fire engine red timer danced across the coffee table. It spun near the edge, ready to leap to its death and sputter on the rug. She snatched it up, blank face twisting to a snarl as the plastic dug into her cut and burn. She switched hands and turned it off, silence slamming into her as she blew on her pulsing hand. Late morning light pulled her eye to the window and the snow across the ground. She squinted at dozens of dark spots in the snow, creeping to the window and following them, the light catching the edges of the indentations. Footprints, the toes all facing the house and trekking around it as the wind blew new snow into them, soon to cover the tracks. She fished out her phone and snapped photos before they were gone, setting her jaw and pursing her lips. "No one wants to break in here, Sarah," she thought with a smirk. "It's probably just kids." She touched the glass and shivered at the cold seeping into her wounds. "What if there are, though?" she retorted herself. "If there are," she whispered, "we'll just kill them."
Friday, January 13th. Sarah stepped through the open bedroom door, feet gliding over the floor as Riley yawned in the crook of her arm and leaned his heavy head against her breast. She stared forward, knowing in the way of dreams that the bedroom door was shut again as she descended the stairs. Her right hand trailed the rail as she floated down, eyes unblinking and blind. She rounded the landing for the kitchen and pulled a paring knife from the drawer, setting it to her naked breast and reopening the scab on her left nipple. The pain was cold and distant, an aching memory as silent tears rolled down her cheeks onto Riley's blanketed chest and belly. She licked the blade clean and slid it into the dishwasher, hefting Riley's head to her chest and shifting until his mouth was at her nipple, half smothering him until he took to her and drank. She spun on her heels, long black hair arching before she passed the stairs and foyer for the living room and stood before the coffee table, facing the faux fireplace. She breathed deeply as Riley nursed, warmth rising up her legs from the floor and enveloping her like wings, each minute twitch of their feathers churning clove, nutmeg, sage, and cinnamon into her nostrils. It blew into her face, stirring her hair as something settled on the back of her tongue, something earthy, dark, and bitter. Knock, knock, came the window to her right. Knock, 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 knock. She swiveled on her heels and faced the window, closing the distance and opening the latch. She thrust the window open, blind eyes weeping as the harsh wind rushed her and sent her hair flying behind. The window beside knocked, slow and deliberate, 7 times. She moved to it, undid the latch, and slid it open, to be accosted by the howling wind. 7 knocks sprung from the window over the couch, then the one beside, and the ones in the kitchen, the dining room, the washroom, the pantry, each one calling 7 times, each one opened and spilling in the cold. Sarah stood amid the pantry and all her wares, her jars and cans and boxes, her bags and tubs and baskets, and shivered beneath the warmth. Goosebumps rippled out from her nape in waves in the wake of cool, dry air, falling and stopping steady as breath. "Sarah?" an accented feminine voice whispered from the kitchen. She spun on her heels and glided over the floor, wide eyes bleeding tears as the voice came again, whispering her name from the back door. She stopped in front of it and waited, flesh still and cold as stone as the wind swirled around the house and leapt inside to dance on her naked skin.
Sarah.
It came long and sweet, like a mother to her favorite daughter, just from the other side of the wood. Then a knock. Another knock. And another, until there were 7. Sarah undid the locks and twisted the knob, pushing the door open. The wind grabbed it and slammed it against the house, but there was no noise. Only the wind and something broken and sour trying to scream over it. The smell clogged her nose, hot, stinging spices mingling with sweet and bitter. It filled her mouth and churned up bile, mixing with the taste of black earth until mud slid into her throat. She swallowed.
Sarah.
The voice came from the darkness just outside the threshold, quick, clipped, and pleased.
Sarah, my sweet, precious mama.
Her throat tightened at the word, tears welling for the sting of dry eyes and the tightness building in her chest. She swallowed, guts jumping and sliding together as she stared into the sharp-eyed darkness of the night and cold.
Sarah.
The voice clipped the air behind her, and she spun like a puppet on strings, pulled through the blackness of the unlit house to the front door. Riley jerked in her arms, pulled from her breast, and whined with the threat of a cry. Her eyes welled and overflowed as her guts reached up and slithered around her heart. Her breath came quick and quicker, shallow as the wintry wind settled on her skin and stung like ants. Her jaw unclenched, fingers trembling as she stared at the black, bleeding grain of the door, lips parting and letting the earth fall free.
Sarah.
The voice whispered into her ear from behind and in front, from beyond the door. Cold hands gripped her shoulders as fresh tears fell and the cloudy promise of a memory reached to be seen. Something pale and hungry and smiling. Something groping for her.
Sarah Bowen,
the voice whispered sweetly, breath warm on the side of her face as slender fingers gripped her tight and tighter, thumbs stroking her cold skin.
Remember the door? Someone's there waiting for you. Can't you hear them knocking?
Knock, knock. It came from outside the door.
You don't want to keep them waiting, Sarah. They've been eager to come in and see you.
The lips graced her ear, leaning onto her cheek and stinging like peppers in the mouth. Knock, knock, knock.
My sweet.
The voice came softer, a breath, a shadow.
Sarah. Quick. Remember the door. Open the door.
Her voice told her in her own head as a hand came around her wrist, warmer than her skin, nails brushing gently as it pressed and held her still. Warmth seeped into her back, fitting into her like Joseph, and calming her skin. Warmth came from the hand and settled inside, hot and tender like Joseph's hand. The slithering snakes uncoiled in her belly and let go of her heart. The tightness lifted. Her breath came clear and slow. She stood like stone, staring at the door with unseeing eyes. Knock, knock. She undid the locks and took the handle, slowly opening the door and letting the wind race around her like a ghostly river, pulling and pushing until her hair flapped like an angry crow. She faced the darkness and the orange street lights, the snow thin and old on the ground, dirty like tarnished silver in the half-moon. She knelt and set Riley against the wall as he squirmed and whimpered, tears welling in his eyes. Sarah shot her arm out over him and settled it on his chest. He squirmed under her. She pressed, just hard enough for him to feel the pressure through his blankets. He slapped her hand, whimpers lessening as he arched his back and fell, large eyes clamoring to her grip, then her, face twisted in want of scream. He went quiet. She pulled her arm away, stood, and turned into the dark house in one motion, hovering into the kitchen and unsheathing a long blade from the knife block. In a second she was back,
kneeling inside the threshold and reaching out into the hungry winds to grab at the throat of the dead calf laid on the doormat. She lifted the knife, glinting like sunset in the orange lights, and sank it to the hilt of the side of the youngster's neck, picking it up until only half the blade was in the wound. Old, sticky blood clung to the knife as she leaned her full weight into the hilt. It crunched and popped through the neck as she stared blankly into the night, nearly falling onto the calf. She lifted herself up and came down again and again until she'd cut through the throat and dark blood pooled and soaked into the brindle fur. She plunged the blade into the sunken gut and gripped the two halves of the creature's second smile, pulling them apart, muscles rippling and bones straining as the remaining skin and flesh stretched and snapped. Her face was still and hard as a mask. The head jolted back, neck snapping until the white of the vertebrae shone in the porch light like fresh snow. She plucked up the knife and set the tip to work, unstitching and slicing through what little flesh held the skull to the body, and finally carving between the bones. The head fell free. Its milky eyes stared at her like it wanted to ask a question. Its jaw sloshed open, tongue spilling into the thick pool of blood. She picked it up by the ear, staring into the night and the watchful, pale eyes of the unseen shadow as she set it aside. The two watched each other, the pale shade standing still and unseen, sharp eyes fixed like stars glinting on a knife, and Sarah bent over a corpse, slicing away the skin on the calf's shoulder and flanks to get at the purple meat beneath. She cut and carved and sliced, peeling away strips of old muscle and letting them slither into her stomach, cold and slimy as slugs. Her mouth watered as she chewed and gnawed, her eyes trapped in the gaze of the watchful night standing in front of her fence, slender hand on her gate. Stale blood trickled down her lips, like her tears, beading on the animal's fur. She flipped the carcass over and flayed the blood-soaked shoulder and flank of the other side, slicing the flesh free and inhaling it, teeth nearly catching her own fingers as she snapped. She crammed it inside, full and fuller, until she could hardly chew and had to swallow the flesh whole. Her throat bulged and stretched, burning as her stomach clenched. Her throat tightened like a vice, tossing the churning meat back down. She swallowed and took a deep breath, uplifting the knife as something sweet glided into her ears, high and sharp. She plunged the blade into the side of the gut, carving a slit along its ribs and setting the knife aside to reach into the cool, sticky host. She clawed at the liver and pulled, holding it in front of her face, tilting her head back and stretching open her mouth until it should have broken her. She lowered the liver inside and pushed and shoved the rest in, chewing all the while and swallowing coppery, sandy chunks until her stomach bulged and groaned. She reached back inside for the kidney, for the appendix, the lungs, the heart, gnawing and swallowing down the rancid blood and stale meat. Wind chimes sung in the breeze, tossed about like a dead bird as she gnashed and chewed and ate, her eyes fixed on the pale gaze, her skin awash in goosebumps as she breathed in sugar and spice and earth and blood. It slid between her fingers and lips and teeth, dripping onto her breasts and running down her chin and throat, drying there in black rivulets. The high, hollow scream of the chimes climbed above her, clanging sweet as baby's laughter, sweet as a dream. In the darkness of the street, a teenage boy ran naked, motioning to others to follow him as he spun around on his bare heel and back the way he ran, mouth open in laughter. But there were no voices, only the chimes. Another one came from the shadows and another until dozens ran together in the dark, looping the street and chasing each other between the streetlights, boys and girls, short and tall, skinny, pale, with bright eyes and shining hair. They all played naked, they all laughed and shouted and danced, but they were all silent. There were only the chimes. Something squawked in the darkness. Sarah grabbed the knife and lifted the calf's leg, tilting her head as she stared at the male's organ. It squawked again and again,
the hoarse voice screaming for her beside the chimes, and again when she set the knife to the scrotum, carving it open and reaching inside. It came again, louder and harder. The voice cheered, and again as she pulled the testicles free and severed the cords, setting them aside on the porch. She picked the leg back up and set the edge to the sheath, opening it and reaching inside, pulling the naked organ into the cold air and ridding it of its skin. She cut and turned and set the severed member beside the testicles, tilting her head at a blackbird that had landed and ruffled its wings. It croaked at her and stooped to peck at the raw flesh, tearing them open and shaking its head to break small bites away that it could gobble. Their eyes met as it rose and tilted its head, croaking again and straightening to look at her head-on. Its black eyes gleamed in the porch light, beak dripping with blood, feathers sticky and sullied with it. It champed its jaws and let a low, gravelly note loose from its throat, as if to say something.
"I told you I would eat,"
it seemed to say in her own voice, though deepening to another woman's.
"And you were to feed me."
The voice became a croak before the bird sank its beak into what remained of the testicles. Sarah sat on her heels, back straight, face forward, eyes locked with the pale gaze of the unseen shade. It smiled wide and kind, like what any other mother might show their children, what her mother never did, hands worming onto the pale gate and gripping it tightly as the naked children whirled and danced, chimes still flying from their mouths as the wind tossed their golden silver copper hair. They leapt, almost carried by the gusts, and crouched and jumped, bending too far, smiling too wide, skin like marble as black veins pulsed here and there. She stood, licking her fingers and running her tongue over her hand and forearm where the blood still clung from reaching inside. The crow called to her as she took the door with her clean hand and swung it shut. The band of children bolted for the house, smiling and giggling with the sounds of wind chimes and catching up in the skirts of the sharp-eyed shadow. The door clicked shut, the lock slid home. She plucked up Riley and spun to face the darkness of the house. Then she found the back door, then the windows of the storeroom and the rest, and left them shut and locked. She climbed the stairs, smooth as water, leaving the flurries of snow to melt on the floor as she passed the banister and faced the shut bedroom door. She lifted her arm and knocked 7 times, the sound gone like it was muffled in her ears, and the door slid open and shut behind her as she went to Riley's cradle. She set him down, eyes wide, burning and wet as she stood straight and stared through the window at the half-moon. Knock, 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 rapped the glass. Knock, 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 knock. She stepped around the cradle and lifted her hand to open the window. She stopped. The cinnamon and clove burned in her nostrils. The last of the blood slid down her throat. The warmth became heat on her skin until sweat beaded down her back.
"Open the door,"
a woman's voice said.
"It's cold out there. You don't want them to be cold now, do you?"
Her swollen stomach ached, guts churning as she looked down at the side yard. The pale woman stood there, staring with sharp, bright eyes, with the children fluttering around it, laughing and dancing and cheering, pale, dark-veined, naked creatures. They flashed behind her eyes, their smiles so wide, their teeth too narrow, eyes too far apart, ears too large. The cathedral, the bleached stone opened up in the back of her mind, swimming closer to the front and gathering detail and color. The pain, the loss, the screams. She'd spread her legs and pushed for the thing to climb out of her. The pale, clawed arm ripped her open and tore her flesh and bones apart. Her organs spilled, steaming onto the black stage. It turned. It smiled, and smiled, and smiled. It smiled until its face was cut in 2, until each of its fanged teeth came clear through its angry gums, until its pale eyes fell on her and shone like a lion at the edge of firelight.
"Mama, I hunger."
She blinked and her tears fell.
Her breath came ragged, panting as her body trembled, her teeth gritting together. Breath hard and loud, but her voice was dead. Her raised arm burned, quivering as it fought to open the latch and let the winter in against her will. Her flesh betrayed her. Her flesh screamed at her. "Open the window," it howled on the wind. "Open it! Open it, you worthless sow!" She stared at the unseen shadow, spit flying from her lips as she panted, eyes fighting to stay open as the darkness frowned, and the dancing naked things that looked like children stopped and stared up at her. In their own time, they mouthed, "It's cold outside, miss. Let us in." She hissed a breath through her teeth as the heat scalded her. She steamed in their warm bedroom, sweat dripping from her elbow, her nose, clumping her hair and puddling around her feet. Her arm shook like a seizure, heart racing as those cool hands gripped her shoulders, sharp as ice, and those fiery lips pressed into her ear. "Open the window, Sarah," it whispered. "You're so warm. Let in a little night air to cool the room. I'm sure Joseph's soaking the sheets. We don't want that before he goes to work, do we?" Sarah couldn't answer, voice or no. She wrestled with her raised arm, pulling back before it got the upper hand and straining as it inched closer to the glass like dogs on a rope. 1 second away from her focus and the window would open. 1 second, just one. Knock, 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 came the window. Knock, 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 faster than before. "They're so cold, Sarah. Won't you let them in?" She found the children, and they stood like statues, starry eyes, silver, green, gold, and ruby. Their skin was like marble against the dirty snow, their hair dark as obsidian, brilliant as silver or gold or electrum, lively as copper and brass. The knocks came again, faster and harder, and the children opened their mouths and sang, high and sweet and beautiful. A choir of little pipes and chimes and cymbals moving as one like the wind around them, stirring the air and snow and trees and beating against the glass in 7 hard pounds. Those lips burned, searing Sarah's cheek as the breath fell over her face. "Open the door, Sarah. You've already opened the others. Open this one." Something pulled her wrist, lurching it forward and slamming it into the window. She pulled back, body stuck like it was nailed down, shoulder aching and body burning as her flesh trembled and poured sweat. "Open it." The voice fell, and with it the smell of burnt hair and coal and ash. The wind howled and squawked and screamed as a crow settled on the sill and flapped its wings at her, tapping its bloody beak on the glass 7 times. Sarah's lips peeled back over her teeth, heart racing, guts churning, every muscle tight and aching on the edge of failure. "Open it, girl." The crow tapped the glass 7 times and stared at her. Sarah blinked and winced and whimpered as the slender fingers turned to ice and squeezed, cutting deep. Slam, 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 slam. The crow bashed its beak into the glass and screamed at her, "Slam, slam, slam." "You started this, Sarah," the voice whispered, cold settling over her skin like winter rain and taking her breath, reaching into her, around her, fitted to her like Joseph before they made love. "You agreed, and you shall follow the rules." The crow screamed and took to the air, rounding to the window and bashing its head into the glass once, twice, 5 times, 7. "Let us in!" The children screamed and cried, and wailed like they were dying, high and sharp, scraping into her ears and gnawing down her spine, her skull. "Just open the door, Sarah," the voice whispered. "Remember the door." She gasped and saw the yawning archway of the cathedral, the bleeding black doors that swiveled open, groaning like old giants, until the hall shone, beckoning her like the hungry throat of a starving beast, the edge of a cliff, the edge of a knife. "Come inside," it begged. "Open the door." She balled her fist, gritting her teeth and hissing until she slung spit out like a rabid dog. She snarled, body burning, heart racing, blood pounding in her ears, and opened her mouth in a scream that couldn't fly. Her hand crashed into her thigh. She screamed out with the force of it, her voice finally free. She blinked, fresh tears falling as she breathed a free breath, and spun away from the window, back to the shadow and eyes rolling into the blackness. Something shrill scraped the air and jabbed her from ears to chest. Sarah groaned and looked to Joseph's side. Empty. She turned to the window as the sun crested over the horizon and lurched up, eyes wide as she grabbed her phone, 3 missed alarms, and raced to Riley. She stopped at the crib and covered her mouth, belching and swallowing down vomit. She breathed deeply and let her guts settle as Riley screamed up at her, legs and arms flailing, voice hoarse and sharp and desperate as the one in her dreams. She waved the nausea away, looking down at her stomach and belching. The smell stung her eyes and churned her guts like spoiled milk. She blinked and waved in front of her face, screwing up her eyebrows and cursing before she clutched her stomach and groaned. It swelled out in front of her like she were pregnant, full and heavy and gurgling up at her. She cursed again and swallowed down the spit and bile to clean Riley out of his onesie and old diaper. She wiped him down and dressed him, picking him up and bouncing him only for her stomach to shoot up into her mouth. She slapped her hand over her lips and swallowed what was in her throat, gagging on the sour, rancid, acrid thing still on her tongue. She raced to the bathroom. Riley clutched in her arms and leaned over the toilet, spitting the rot up and staring at the half-chewed thing. "It's food," she thought. "It's just food." She grimaced and wiped her mouth before flushing and went to the sink, rinsing and spitting again. She shook her head and rinsed her fingers, furrowing her brow at the stain under her nails. She checked the hand holding Riley, and it was there too, purple, brown, and flaking. She ran her thumbnail under the others, but it wouldn't come loose. "Blood?" she thought. "Did I scratch myself in my sleep?" She looked down and stared. "Why am I naked?" She wrinkled her nose. "Jesus, and I smell like a barn." "Don't let Joseph sleep so close under the blanket," she added in her head. She brought Riley back to his crib and kissed his forehead. "You can eat in a minute, bud. Mommy needs to get clean first." She turned, eyes washing over the dried salt stains on the floor in front of the window before she turned on the hot water and groaned at another rotten belch. Hey y'all, I hope you enjoy this installment. This series has really been fun to write, and it's always cool to see your ideas come into fruition. Let me know what you think about this series, and if y'all'd like to see more content like it. And, as always, like, comment, and subscribe if you like what I'm doing. And, while you're at it, might as well go ahead and share this video. Okay, I'll see y'all next time. Bye.